For years the story sounded simple. Dogs were said to have come from a single path, a single turning point, a clean line from wild ancestors to the companions at our feet. But the oldest DNA does not sit quietly inside that version. It keeps interrupting it. In bones that should have confirmed the old answer, scientists found something else. Traces from different regions, different populations, and different lives braided together over thousands of years. That means the history of the modern dog may never have belonged to one place at all. It may have been built the hard way, piece by piece, through local dogs, wolf-related wild populations, herding groups, hunter-gatherers, migrations, trade, and long human contact that left marks no one could see until ancient genomes finally spoke. So, what actually shaped the dogs we know today? Why do modern breeds carry signals from so many distant branches? And how could a story so familiar turn out to be far less linear than everyone expected? The answer is not small. It reaches into ancestry, movement, selection, and the strange intimacy between humans and dogs. And once that picture starts to clear, the old origin story stops looking complete. For a long time, the story seemed tidy enough to stand on its own. A line of dogs, a line of ancestors, a line of progress. That was the version people repeated because it was easier to hold in the mind than the real past ever is. Then the ancient genomes began to break that shape apart. In one fossil after another, the same pattern kept surfacing. Not a single origin, but overlapping signals from local dog populations, wild relatives tied to wolves, and human groups that moved animals, food, tools, and habits across wide landscapes. The first surprise was not that dogs were old, it was that their history refused to stay in one place. Once that became visible, the next question was unavoidable. If modern breeds carry ancestry from several ancient groups, where did those threads first meet? The answer did not sit in one cemetery, one settlement, or one region. It appeared in fragments. A buried dog from one era looked closer to a population far away than to the animals around it. Another carried a mix that made sense only if people, herds, and working animals had already been traveling through the same routes for generations. The ancient DNA was not just identifying dogs, it was mapping contact zones. That is where the story stopped being simple biology and started becoming human history, because each mixed genome suggested a place where different lives had crossed, a village where dogs lived beside the remains of cattle and pottery, a migration corridor where herding groups carried animals with them, a hunting camp where dogs and people adapted to the same harsh seasons, a settled community where breeding choices slowly narrowed certain traits while preserving others. The more carefully the samples were compared, the harder it became to imagine domestication as a single event. It looked more like repeated intimacy, repeated selection, repeated exchange, and the method mattered. These conclusions did not come from loose similarities or broad guesses. They came from ancient DNA sequencing under strict contamination controls, ancestry modeling, and Bayesian reconstruction that allowed researchers to compare time, geography, and inheritance with unusual precision. That precision exposed something else as well. Traits were not inherited in a straight line. Coat pattern, body shape, temperament, and working aptitude were being assembled through long admixture, not by a clean split between wild and tame. The dogs that eventually became companions, herders, guardians, and workers seemed to have emerged from populations already shaped by movement and contact. At first, that might sound like a technical detail. It is not. It changes what domestication means. If ancestry was layered, then selection was layered too. Humans were not choosing from a finished product. They were living inside the process, nudging it, rewarding it, carrying it, and sometimes unintentionally reshaping it whenever they moved between regions. A dog tied to a settlement was never fully isolated from the dogs that crossed paths with traders, pastoralists, or hunters beyond it. The old picture begins to weaken here, because every piece of evidence creates a larger problem. If dogs absorbed ancestry from several populations over millennia, then where exactly does one origin end and another begin? If regional lineages kept blending, then how many beginnings were there? And if modern breeds still preserve those ancient mixtures, what we call a breed may be less a pure endpoint than a recent arrangement built on much older foundations. That possibility changes the scale of the story entirely. What looked like a question about dogs becomes a question about human movement, memory, and adaptation. The traces inside those genomes suggest that domestication did not happen once and then spread neatly outward. It happened in places, at different moments, under different pressures, and then kept happening as people and animals kept meeting again. That is why the evidence feels so difficult to reduce. It does not describe a ladder. It describes a web. And once that web appears, the next layer becomes impossible to ignore. The same ancient signals that explain body size or coat texture also point to deeper differences in purpose. Some dogs were shaped for closeness, others for endurance, others for work beside herds, for movement through cold, for alertness around human settlements. Those functions did not emerge after the fact. They were part of the selection landscape from the beginning, woven into the admixture itself. In other words, the history of dogs is not just about when they were domesticated. It is about how many human worlds they learned to survive inside at once. That is the first real crack in the old narrative. The next one is even harder to absorb, because it suggests that the places where people believed they were preserving animals were often the same places where genetic mixing was accelerating. The more the evidence is followed, the more domestication looks less like a single threshold, and more like a long series of thresholds, each one marked by contact, choice, and inheritance. And just when that begins to feel like a complete answer, another sample changes the picture again. The first hypothesis seemed strong enough to hold. The admixture patterns looked like the obvious explanation. Dogs had been mixed, moved, and reshaped wherever humans carried them. Yet, the deeper the data went, the more that explanation began to thin out. Some ancient dogs did not simply reflect nearby populations. They carried ancestry that made sense only if movement between regions had been happening for much longer than the visible archaeological record suggested. In other words, the genomes were not just describing contact. They were describing repeated contact, old contact, contact that left echoes across time. That is where a second layer emerged. A dog from one landscape could be genetically closer to distant working populations than to animals found in the same excavation area. Another sample could show a blend that matched no single local tradition, as if the animal had inherited a history already assembled somewhere else. At first it was tempting to treat those cases as exceptions, but exceptions kept appearing, and once a pattern starts repeating, it stops being an exception. It becomes the key. A new question followed immediately. If these dogs were not formed by one local event, then what was actually being inherited from place to place? The answer unfolded in pieces, not just bodies, not just coat colors, not just temperament. The inherited material seemed to track with tasks, environments, and human expectations. In settlements where people stored food and lived more permanently, dogs became more attuned to space, territory, and proximity. In mobile herding groups, selection favored endurance, alertness, and the ability to read movement. In hunting contexts, different pressures shaped speed, coordination, and responsiveness. The same species was being repeatedly tuned to different human worlds. That idea made the genomes feel less like isolated specimens and more like witnesses. They were preserving the consequences of choices made over generations. Which animals were kept near hearths, which were allowed to breed, which were exchanged across groups, which were moved with flocks, which were taken along routes where stone, grain, and pottery also traveled. The domestic dog begins to look less like a passive result of human management and more like a companion species that co-developed alongside the systems humans were building. Still, a useful explanation can become dangerous when it feels complete too early. A second false answer had to be tested. Perhaps the strong ancestry mixing simply reflected later expansion, a kind of genetic blending after domestication was already stable. That would preserve the old timeline while adding some complexity. But the ancient DNA pushed back. The admixture was not concentrated only in the latest dogs. It appeared deep in the record, suggesting that blending was not a late complication. It was present near the foundation itself. The timeline had to stretch backward, and once it stretched backward, the geography changed too. This was no longer a story of one cradle radiating outward. It was a network of corridors, crossings, and local centers that influenced one another. Some regions seem to have acted as reservoirs of variation, others as channels where animals and people met repeatedly. The Bayesian models reinforced that picture by connecting time and place in ways that made isolated origin stories look too clean to survive scrutiny. Each comparison made the same point from a different angle. The history of dogs had been regional, layered, and porous. That porosity matters because it explains why modern breeds can look so distinct while still carrying overlapping traces from shared ancestral pools. A companion breed, a herding breed, a working breed. Each one may appear to represent a narrow identity, but inside the genome, the older arrangement is still visible. The shapes that people recognize today are recent surfaces over much older mixtures. The genome remembers what the eye cannot see. There is also a human side to that memory. The regions that produced the strongest patterns were not random. They were often the same places where human communities became more settled, where ceramics appeared, where livestock management intensified, where trade routes linked groups that had once been farther apart. Dogs moved inside those changes, not outside them. They were part of the exchange system, part of the economy of trust, part of the quiet infrastructure of survival. A dog that stayed near a hearth and a dog that followed a herd were both responding to the same broad historical pressure. Humans were reorganizing space, and dogs were learning to live inside that reorganization. That is why the story keeps widening. What began as a question about ancestry now touches migration, technology, subsistence, and social memory. It is not simply that dogs accompanied people. It is that they helped mark the boundaries of human life as those boundaries shifted. Some were carried across distances. Some were exchanged between groups. Some were selected because they fit a new environment better than the old one. In every case, the animal was not just adapting to humans. Humans were also adapting their own lives around the animals they valued. Then comes the part that makes the old model finally fail. If multiple ancestral streams were already interacting across wide areas, then the idea of one original dog population becomes too narrow to explain the diversity we now see. It is not enough to say that dogs were domesticated and then diversified. The evidence suggests that diversification was happening while domestication was still unfolding. Selection and admixture were working together. The process was not linear, it was recursive. That recursive quality changes the meaning of the modern dog. What looks like breed identity today may actually be the latest visible layer of a much older relational system. The signals of local dogs, wolf-related wild populations, pastoral communities, and hunter-gatherer interactions did not disappear. They were folded into the lineages that survive now. The result is a living archive of human movement and ecological adaptation, and that opens the hardest question of all. If the earliest evidence already points to a web rather than a single source, what else have simplified narratives hidden? What regions remain unsampled? What lineages were lost before anyone could record them? What part of the dog's story survives only as a faint signal inside modern genomes? Those questions do more than deepen the research. They redefine the shape of the history itself. At this point, the investigation stops feeling like a search for one answer and starts feeling like a reconstruction of a whole relationship. The genetic record is not just telling scientists where dogs came from. It is showing how humans and dogs learned to live in the same changing world, how selection traveled with people, and how partnership itself became a force of evolution. And in the middle of that realization, the strongest evidence no longer supports a single beginning. It supports a long, shared, unfinished inheritance. There are more details in the complete analysis about how these regional lineages compare, what the Bayesian models recover, and why broader sampling matters so much for the timeline. The link is in the description and the first comment, because the deeper picture becomes clearer when the pieces are laid out side by side. And the more the pattern is traced, the harder it becomes to believe that any one origin was ever enough. The turning point came from a detail that at first looked too small to matter. One cluster of ancient dogs did not simply weaken the old origin story. It overturned the assumption underneath it. For years, the easiest explanation had been that domestication began in one main place and then spread outward, gathering local variation along the way. But one of the deeper comparisons showed something far less tidy. A dog population in one region carrying genetic links that made sense only if multiple ancestral streams had already been crossing before the supposed center of origin could explain them. The supposed starting line was no longer a starting line. It was already a crossroads. That changed the entire reading of the evidence. What had seemed like a history of diffusion from a single source now looked like a landscape of repeated convergence. In some lineages, local dogs were not just receiving ancestry from neighboring groups. They were preserving a record of exchange with wild canids, moving herding communities, and human networks that had been in motion for far longer than the linear story allowed. The reanalysis did not merely add complexity, it removed the comfort of sequence. There may never have been one moment when dogs became domestic and then stopped changing. The process itself appears to have stayed open. A second false answer almost took hold here. Perhaps the regional differences were only the result of later trade, later expansion, later mixing after domestication was already complete. But that interpretation collapsed when older samples showed the same pattern at earlier dates. The signals were already present before the supposed spread could account for them. In other words, the mix was not a late ornament on top of a finished story. It was part of the foundation. The consequence is severe. The origin of modern dogs cannot be reconstructed as a single event followed by simple branching. It has to be treated as a moving system. That system becomes easier to understand when the human side is placed back in the center. Dogs were not traveling through empty geography. They were moving through settlements with storage pits, ceramic traditions, animal management, seasonal movement, and social exchange. A village that kept dogs near food stores created different pressures from a camp that moved with herds. A trading corridor created different pressures again. Each setting preserved some traits and filtered out others. What looked like natural diversity was also a map of human choices repeated over generations. Then the reinterpreted signal begins to reshape the whole narrative. Traits that once looked like breed-specific signatures may be much older than the breeds themselves. Body proportions, coat patterns, temperaments, and working behaviors were not assembled in a single burst of invention. They were carried through many rounds of selection, each round leaving a trace in the genome. The modern companion dog, in that sense, is not a clean descendant of one ancient line. It is the visible result of countless encounters between local populations and wider human worlds. This is where the story changes from genetic history to something larger. Because if dogs were being shaped inside social systems of herding, hunting, settlement, and exchange, then they were also being shaped inside memory. Communities remembered which dogs guarded grain, which followed livestock, which kept pace in cold landscapes, which calmed children, which warned of strangers. Those preferences became invisible selection pressures. Over time, they hardened into lineages that now seem fixed only because we are looking at the end of a very long process. That is why the newest comparison is so unsettling to the older model. It suggests that the dogs closest to us today are not the product of a single domestication event with later embellishments. They are the product of a long negotiation between place and movement, between wild ancestry and human intervention, between local continuity and distant exchange. The line that was supposed to be simple now looks braided, and once the braid is seen, another possibility appears. Maybe the question was never just where dogs came from. Maybe it was how humans repeatedly made room for them in different worlds, and how those worlds left their mark on the animals in return. That shift matters because it turns domestication into relationship, not just process. It makes ancestry feel lived, rather than abstract. For that reason, the strongest conclusion is not that the old story was entirely false, but that it was far too narrow. The evidence now points to a series of regional beginnings, overlapping contacts, and generations of selection that connected dogs to multiple human lifeways at once. What survives in modern breeds is not a purified origin, but a convergence, a memory of many places, a record of many hands. And if the goal is to map that record more precisely, the next step is obvious. More ancient DNA from more regions, more time slices, more local populations that can show where the braid tightened and where it opened. Until then, every simplified origin story remains provisional. The deeper truth is already visible, and it is larger than a single cradle. It is a history of repeated meeting, repeated choice, and repeated inheritance that never fully closed. If the full analysis is laid out carefully, the pattern becomes even clearer. The modern dog is not the endpoint of one road, but the product of many roads, crossing over and over again. And once that realization settles in, it is hard not to see human partnership itself as one of the oldest forces shaping the species. If you want the complete breakdown of how these ancestral threads were compared and why the regional model matters so much, the The link is in the description and the first comment. The deeper the timeline goes, the less sense it makes to talk about a single beginning. At the end of the evidence, the picture does not become simpler. It becomes more honest. The ancient DNA does not point to a single birthplace where dogs suddenly became what we now call dogs. It points to repeated meetings, repeated choices, repeated crossings between local canids, wolf-related populations, and human communities that were changing their own lives at the same time. The result is not a straight line. It is a long accumulation of contact, selection, movement, and memory. That matters because it changes the meaning of every modern breed. What looks, on the surface, like a fixed identity is actually the visible edge of a much older convergence. Companion dogs, herders, workers, guardians, and hunters did not appear from nowhere as separate creations. They emerged from deeper ancestry that had already been mixed, sorted, carried, and reshaped across generations. The genome keeps that history even when the body no longer shows it clearly. In that sense, the dog in front of us is never only the dog in front of us. The clearest revelation is that domestication was not a closed event. It was a process with no clean finish line. In one region, people favored animals that could stay close to storage and settlement. In another, they kept dogs that could travel with herds or react quickly in open country. Elsewhere, different pressures produced different combinations again. Those pressures were cultural, ecological, and practical all at once. Dogs were selected for the worlds humans were building, and those worlds were never identical. That is why the data keeps refusing a single origin story. The story was always being rewritten by movement. This is also where the human meaning becomes harder to ignore. Every mixed lineage in the ancient record implies a relationship that was stable enough to last, flexible enough to adapt, and close enough to leave traces in inheritance. Humans were not simply using dogs. They were coexisting with them in ways that shaped both sides. The exchange was not symbolic. It was biological, social, and historical. Dogs followed human roots, but they also helped define them. They were part of how people managed herds, guarded food, hunted, traveled, and recognized home. That is why the final answer does not feel like a conclusion in the usual sense. It feels like a wider frame. The origin of dogs is not one moment hidden in the past. It is a long relationship made visible through DNA, and once that relationship is seen clearly, the idea of purity starts to lose its grip. What survives is something more complex and more real, a species shaped by contact, carried through changing landscapes, and held together by generations of shared adaptation. The next step is obvious. More ancient samples from more regions will keep refining the map, tightening some paths, and opening others that are still invisible. But even now, the deeper lesson is already there. History is rarely a single line when living things are involved. It is usually a web of partial answers, local pressures, and inherited traces that keep traveling long after the original moment is gone. And maybe that is why the dog remains such a powerful companion species. Its genome does not tell the story of independence. It tells the story of staying close long enough for two histories to become one another's inheritance. That is not a small detail. It is the real shape of the partnership. If the full breakdown is laid out carefully, the larger pattern becomes impossible to miss. Ancient DNA does not just revise canine origin, it reveals how deeply human and canine histories were braided together from the beginning. The link is in the description and the first comment, where the complete reconstruction shows why so many separate lineages matter. The answer was never going to be one place, one moment, or one line.